Always sit here. Find yourself another seat. That is my seat. Ma'am, please just move so we can depart.
Then this plane isn't departing.
Hold departure. Do not push back.
Part 1. The Public Wrong. The first thing Clara Bennett noticed was not the woman sitting in her seat. It was the way the flight attendant looked at the boarding pass in Clara's hand, then looked at Clara, as if the two things could not possibly belong together. Clara stood in the first-class cabin of Meridian Atlantic Flight 482, with her leather travel bag resting against her ankle, and her fingers wrapped around a paper ticket she had printed that morning. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Outside the window, the runway lights blurred against the gray morning sky. Her seat was 3A. The woman sitting in it did not look surprised. She looked comfortable. A white woman in her early 60s had already placed a cashmere scarf across the seat, opened a tablet on the tray table, and arranged a cup of tea beside her. She glanced up at Clara with a polite expression that disappeared almost immediately. "I think there's been a mistake," Clara said. The woman tilted her head. "I don't think so." Clara checked the boarding pass again. 3A. "That's my assigned seat." The woman smiled slightly, the kind of smile that suggested she believed the conversation had already ended. "I was moved here by the gate agent," she said. "They said there was an issue with the seating arrangement." Clara looked toward the aisle. The gate agent was gone. The other passengers were still finding their places, placing bags in overhead compartments, trying not to notice the tension forming in the narrow space between the seats. A younger man across the aisle looked up from his laptop. He noticed the boarding pass in Clara's hand. He noticed the empty seat number displayed above the woman's head. He said nothing. Clara had learned that silence could become part of the problem. She was 38 years old, the founder of a medical technology company that provided diagnostic systems to rural hospitals across the United States. She had spent 12 years building a company from a borrowed office and a notebook full of ideas. But none of that mattered in moments like this. People often decided what they thought she was before they knew what she had built. "I'd like to speak with the gate agent," Clara said. The flight attendant, a man named Daniel according to his name badge, looked uncomfortable. "Mom, if there was a seat change approved, I just need to verify." "Of course," Clara replied. "Please verify." Daniel scanned the woman's phone screen, then looked at Clara's boarding pass. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "do you have a confirmation of the change?" The woman's expression tightened. "I was told it was handled." Clara noticed the wording. "Not I changed seats, not I was assigned this seat, I was told." The difference mattered. Daniel looked between them. "Mrs. Bennett, would you mind waiting by the galley while I sort this out?" The request was calm. Almost reasonable, but Clara understood what it meant. The person holding the valid ticket was being asked to move while the person occupying the seat stayed comfortable. "I'd rather wait here," Clara said. Daniel lowered his voice. "We're trying to avoid delaying boarding." Clara looked around the cabin. The delay was not caused by her asking a question. She had learned long ago that staying quiet could make an unfair situation look peaceful. "My concern," she said, "is not boarding time. The concern is that my assigned seat was taken, and I'm being asked to leave it before anyone confirms why." A passenger near the front lowered his phone from where he had been checking messages. Another woman looked away. Then Clara saw the small detail that would later change everything. On the tablet screen beside Mrs. Whitmore's tea was an open passenger information page. Not a boarding pass, a crew note. And Clara recognized the system interface. She had spent years designing healthcare platforms with similar audit trails. She knew exactly what a temporary change looked like. This was not a seat reassignment. Someone had manually overridden something. The question was who? Daniel stepped back toward the cabin door to call for assistance. Clara remained standing beside her own seat. For the first time that morning, she understood this was not about 3A. It was about whether anyone would bother checking the truth before deciding who belonged there. Part 2. The Wrong Story Gains Authority. The first mistake was small. That was how these situations usually began. Not with someone announcing that they had decided who belonged and who did not with a dramatic confrontation. It started with a small assumption that nobody wanted to examine closely enough. Daniel returned less than 2 minutes later with a second flight attendant and a man wearing a dark blue Meridian Atlantic operations jacket. The man introduced himself as Kevin Ross, the cabin service supervisor. Good morning, he said, looking first at Clara, then at Mrs. Whitmore. I understand there may be some confusion with the seating arrangement. Clara noticed something immediately. He did not say mistake. He said confusion, a softer word, a word that made responsibility disappear. I have seat 3A, Clara said, holding out her boarding pass. The passenger currently sitting there says she was moved by a gate agent, but nobody has verified that change. He nodded. Mrs. Whitmore, do you have the updated assignment? The older woman placed her tablet down carefully. I explained already. Gate agent handled it. Kevin looked at Daniel. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. No record yet, Mrs. Whitmore sighed. I don't understand why this is becoming such a big issue. Her voice remained calm. That was part of what made it effective. She was not yelling. She was not insulting Clara. She was presenting herself as the reasonable person trapped in an unnecessary problem. I'm happy to resolve this, Clara said. I just need the seat assignment verified. Kevin looked at Clara's ticket again. Bennett, could you please take another seat temporarily while we investigate? There it was. The solution offered before the facts were established. Clara kept her expression neutral. Which seat? Kevin paused. The cabin is full. So you're asking me to leave my assigned seat without knowing whether this passenger was reassigned? We're trying to keep the boarding process moving. Clara looked toward the entrance of the cabin. Passengers were still entering. Nobody had missed the flight. Nobody was standing in an emergency aisle, but the urgency was being placed on the person asking for verification. Understand the importance of keeping things moving, Clara said. But moving me before confirming the record creates a different problem. Kevin's expression changed slightly. Not anger, frustration. The frustration of someone who believed a simple solution was being rejected. Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward. I'm sure we can find a way to make everyone comfortable. Clara looked at her. The sentence sounded generous, but it avoided the actual issue. Comfort was not the question. Ownership of the seat was. A young woman sitting 2 rows behind them finally spoke. Excuse me, she said. I saw Miss Bennett sitting here before boarding started. She had her bag already placed. Everyone looked at her. The woman immediately seemed unsure. I mean, I don't know what happened after that. I just saw her arrive first. Kevin nodded politely. Thank you for letting us know. He did not ask her name. He did not ask for a statement. He did not write anything down. Clara noticed. A witness could exist and still be ignored. Kevin stepped toward the aisle. Let me check with the gate team. As he walked away, Mrs. Whitmore lowered her voice. You know, this would be easier if you didn't make assumptions about people. Clara looked at her. I'm asking people not to make assumptions about me. The woman smiled faintly. I think you're misunderstanding. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she did not. That was the difficult part. Clara had spent enough years in boardrooms to know that bias rarely arrived wearing a name tag. It often arrived dressed as efficiency. It used words like procedure, timing, customer experience, and keeping things simple. It returned holding a handheld device. I spoke with the gate. And, Clara asked. He hesitated. The agent remembers moving a passenger into first class. Mrs. Whitmore straightened. There you go. Clara looked at the device in his hand. Moving which passenger? Kevin looked down. That's what we're confirming. The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, Clara noticed the direction everyone's attention had shifted. The assumption was already forming. Mrs. Whitmore had a first-class seat. Clara was questioning it. Therefore, Clara was creating the problem. That was the story becoming official before the facts arrived. Daniel leaned closer to Kevin and quietly said something. Clara could not hear the words, but she saw Kevin's reaction, a slight pause. A glance toward Mrs. Whitmore, then back toward Clara. Something in the system had changed, not enough to solve the problem. Only enough to reveal that the problem was bigger than a seat. Kevin lowered the device. Ms. Bennett, can I ask what your relationship is with Meridian Atlantic? The question landed differently. Not because it was aggressive, because it was irrelevant. Clara looked at him carefully. My relationship? Yes. You're trying to understand the situation. She almost smiled. Understand the situation. A phrase people used when they wanted more information about the person complaining than the event being reported. I'm a passenger, Clara said. And your company? Clara looked toward the window. For a moment, she considered answering. She could end this quickly. In sentence? One name. One explanation. But she remembered something her grandmother had told her years earlier, back when Clara was a young engineer entering rooms where people often underestimated her. "Don't make them respect your title," her grandmother had said. "Make them examine their behavior." So Clara looked back at Kevin. "I'm someone with a boarding pass for seat 3A. The cabin became quieter, not because everyone suddenly understood, because nobody had a simple response. Kevin looked down at his device again, and this time he did not look confused. He looked concerned, because the system record had just appeared, and it did not match the story everyone had been accepting. Part 3. The irreversible line. Kevin Ross stared at the handheld device longer than he expected. The cabin around him continued moving. A passenger lifted a suitcase into the overhead bin. A child's voice came from the rear of first class asking for water. The flight attendants continued their boarding routine, but the small space around seat 3A had become its own quiet negotiation. Kevin finally looked up. "Ms. Bennett, can I see your identification?" Clara blinked. "My identification?" "Yes, just to confirm the passenger record." She looked at him for a moment, not because she refused, because the request revealed something important. Her ticket had already been scanned. Her boarding pass had already been accepted. Her seat had already been assigned. The question was no longer whether she was a passenger. The question was whether she was being asked to prove something the system had already confirmed. "I'm happy to verify my identity," Clara said, "but I'd like to understand why the passenger in my assigned seat is not being asked the same thing." Kevin glanced toward Mrs. Whitmore. The woman adjusted the sleeve of her jacket. "I already explained that I was moved." Clara turned back. "And I already explained that I was assigned here." Nobody raised their voice. Everybody needed to. The imbalance was happening in the small decisions. Who was questioned? Who was believed first? Who was expected to be patient? Kevin took a breath. "Let me check one more thing." He stepped into the galley. Daniel followed him. Their conversation was quiet, but Clara could see enough. The two men were looking at the device, then at Mrs. Whitmore, then back at the screen. The young woman who had spoken earlier watched from her seat. After a few seconds, she leaned slightly toward Clara. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Clara looked at her. "For what?" The woman hesitated. "For not saying something sooner." Clara gave a small nod. "Most people don't know when they're allowed to speak." The woman looked down. "I saw what happened. It matters. But I don't know if they'll listen." Clara glanced toward Kevin. "That's usually the part people underestimate." A few minutes later, Kevin returned. Expression had changed. The confidence from earlier was gone. "Miss Bennett," he said, "there appears to have been a manual seat adjustment." Clara waited. "Whom?" Kevin looked uncomfortable. "We're still investigating." Mrs. Whitmore immediately spoke. "I told you the gate agent moved me." Kevin nodded. "Yes, but the system shows the change was made after your original boarding assignment was finalized." The woman's face tightened. "So?" Sarah. Notice the shift. The first version of the story was no longer working. The explanation had changed. That mattered, Kevin continued. "Adjustment also does not include a passenger reassignment code." The words were technical, but Clara understood. Someone had changed the seat. The system did not show a legitimate reason. Mrs. Whitmore leaned back. "Are you suggesting I did something wrong?" Kevin answered carefully. "I'm saying we need to understand what happened." But the damage had already been done. The conversation had moved from confusion to responsibility. Clara looked at the empty space between what people assumed and what the system showed. This was the moment where most people would reveal themselves. Some would apologize. Some would become defensive. Some would attack the person who noticed the problem. Mrs. Whitmore chose the third. "I find it interesting that this has become such an interrogation," she said. "I was trying to help solve a seating issue." Clara looked at her. "You were sitting in my seat." The sentence was simple. No accusation. Performance. Just a fact. Mrs. Whitmore's expression hardened. "Maybe you should be more careful about how you speak to people." Here it was, a familiar turn. The conversation moved away from the action and toward Clara's tone. Kevin noticed it too, but before he could respond, another alert appeared on his device. He looked down. Then his face changed completely. "Wait." Everyone looked at him. Kevin tapped the screen twice. "What?" Daniel asked. Kevin did not answer immediately. He was reading something that had just appeared in the passenger management system. Then he looked at Clara. "Miss Bennett, may I ask if you are traveling alone today?" Clara felt the cabin shift, not because of the question, because of the sudden change in his voice. "No," she said. "Why?" Kevin swallowed. "Because there's another passenger record attached to this incident." Eh. Clara frowned. "Another passenger?" Kevin turned the device slightly toward himself. "I need to confirm before I say anything." He walked away again. This time faster. The young woman across the aisle watched him leave. Mrs. Whitmore looked unsettled for the first time, and Clara realized something. The seat dispute had created a record. The record had triggered a review, and the review was uncovering something nobody in that cabin had expected. A mistake was becoming a pattern, and hands inside Meridian Atlantic's system, someone with authority was about to see exactly how the morning had unfolded. Part 4. Counterforce and Personal Cost. Clara Bennett had spent years learning how organizations protected themselves, not always through obvious lies. Sometimes through timing, sometimes through carefully chosen words, sometimes through people who believed they were simply following procedure. As Kevin walked toward the front galley with the device in his hand, Clara remained standing beside seat 3A. Her carry-on bag was still by her feet. Her coffee had never been poured. Her flight had not even left the ground, yet she already felt the familiar exhaustion that came from having to prove something obvious. She hated that feeling. Not because she was unfamiliar with conflict. She had built a company in an industry where people had questioned her credentials before reading her research, questioned her decisions before seeing her results, and questioned her leadership before learning the size of her team. But those moments were different. In business, she could prepare. She could bring data. She could walk into a conference room with 12 years of work behind her. Here, she was just a passenger standing beside a seat, and that was exactly why she refused to use anything else. A few rows ahead, Kevin spoke quietly with Daniel. Clara watched their body language. Daniel looked concerned. Kevin looked like someone who had just discovered that the problem he was handling was larger than the instructions he had been given. That difference mattered, because mistakes could be corrected. Patterns had to be confronted. Mrs. Whitmore shifted in the seat. "You know," she said softly, "I hope you understand that I didn't ask for this situation." Clara looked at her. "I hope you understand that neither did I." The woman looked toward the window. "I was told there was a seating adjustment, and I'm asking for the record of that adjustment." Mrs. Whitmore sighed. "I don't know why this has to become so formal." Clara almost answered immediately. Then she stopped, because that sentence was the entire issue. As if documentation was the problem, as if asking for verification was unreasonable. She had seen this happen in hospitals before. Not exactly the same way, but with the same structure. Someone questioned a process, and the organization focused on the inconvenience of the question instead of the reason it existed. "Because informal explanations are how mistakes become permanent," Clara said. Mrs. Whitmore looked at her. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Kevin returned. "Miss Bennett, can I speak with you privately for a moment?" Clara glanced around. "About my seat?" "About the passenger record." That answer concerned her more. She stepped toward the galley but stayed within view of the cabin. "What did you find?" Kevin lowered his voice. "The seat change was not connected to your passenger profile." Clara waited. "What does that mean?" "It means someone modified the seating assignment manually without completing the normal verification steps." "Someone from the airline?" Nodded. "Yes. Who? We're still tracing it." Clara looked at him. "Was the change made because of Mrs. Whitmore?" Kevin hesitated. That hesitation answered more than his words could. "We're looking into whether there was a misunderstanding." Clara studied him. A misunderstanding. Another soft word, another way to describe a decision before admitting what kind of decision it was. "Kevin," she said, "I don't need you to agree with me. I need you to follow the record." He nodded slowly. "I understand," but Clara knew something else was happening. The flight was still boarding. The airline wanted the situation contained, not necessarily hidden, contained. There was a difference. Then her phone vibrated. A message from her assistant appeared. "Maya, are you already on board?" Clara typed back. "Yes, minor seating issue." Handling it. A few seconds later, another message came. "Maya, is this about the Meridian Executive Review?" Clara stopped. She had not told anyone on the flight. And not even Maya. Her assistant knew because the meeting was scheduled after landing. A quarterly governance review. Nothing unusual. Except Meridian Atlantic was not just the airline Clara was flying on. It was one of the companies currently evaluating her medical technology platform for a nationwide healthcare partnership. A partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But that was not why she was standing there. Clara locked her phone. She looked at Kevin. Does anyone on this aircraft know who I am? Kevin looked confused. I don't know. Good. Because suddenly the situation had become more important. If this was corrected only after someone recognized her name, then nothing had been corrected. Only her situation had changed, and Clara refused to let that happen. She walked back toward her seat. Mrs. Moore looked up. So, Clara placed her boarding pass on the armrest. So we're waiting for the record. The woman shook her head. Hey, I really think you're making this harder than it needs to be. Clara looked at the seat, then at the woman, then at the flight attendants watching nearby. No, she said quietly. And I think we're finally making it clear. At that exact moment, Kevin's device received another notification. This one made him stop walking, because the person requesting the incident report was not a gate supervisor, not a cabin manager. Not customer service. It was the office responsible for Meridian Atlantic's ownership oversight, and the name attached to the request was one Clara recognized immediately. Her own. Part 5. The reversal or deeper problem. Kevin Ross read the name on his device twice. Not because he did not recognize it, because he did. Clara Bennett. The passenger standing less than 10 feet away was not just another traveler with a disputed seat assignment. She was the founder and majority owner of Bennett Medical Systems, the company whose diagnostic technology Meridian Atlantic had been evaluating for a potential healthcare partnership. But the discovery did not make Kevin feel relieved. It made him uncomfortable, because the facts had not changed. The seat belonged to Clara before anyone knew her name, and that was the part he could not ignore. He walked back toward the cabin slowly. Daniel noticed his expression. What is it? Kevin answered quietly. She's the Bennett. Daniel looked toward Clara. The company? Kevin nodded. Neither man said anything else. They did not need to. The meaning was obvious. But Clara saw the exchange, and she immediately understood what was happening. The information had arrived too late. A few minutes earlier, she had been a passenger asking for her assigned seat. Now she was someone important, and she hated the difference. Kevin approached her. Miss Bennett. Clara raised her hand slightly. Before you say anything, I want to be clear. Kevin stopped. She looked directly at him. I don't want this fixed because of my position. He nodded. I understand. Do you? The question was not aggressive. It was a challenge. Kevin looked down briefly. I think I do. Clara glanced at the seat. If another passenger had my boarding pass, would they have been asked to move? Kevin did not answer immediately. That silence was enough. Clara turned away, not in anger, in disappointment, because she had spent her entire career watching organizations celebrate fairness after discovering someone had influence. Ill fairness happened earlier, before the name was known. Mrs. Whitmore had been listening. When she finally spoke, her voice changed. Everyone looked at her. You're saying she owns part of this company? Kevin looked uncomfortable. I'm not discussing passenger information. Mrs. Whitmore looked at Clara. I didn't know. Clara met her eyes. That's the point. That woman frowned. I think you're misunderstanding me. Maybe. Clara paused. But the question is whether the process would have changed if nobody knew. Kevin became quiet again. This time not because of tension, because nobody had an easy answer. Kevin stepped aside and contacted operations. Within minutes, a voice came through his headset. The operations manager on duty was reviewing the system logs. Kevin, the voice said, we have a problem. Kevin turned away. What kind of problem? The seat modification came from an internal to terminal. Which terminal? A pause. Gate operations. Kevin looked back toward the boarding door. The gate agent was no longer there. Can you identify the user? We're checking. Kevin lowered his voice. Was this approved? Another pause. No, that single word changed the situation. Not because Clara was wealthy, not because she had influence, because now the airline itself had confirmed something important. The passenger who had been treated as difficult had been correct to ask. But there was another problem, a larger one. The system showed the seat change had been entered manually. The reason field was blank. No customer request, no operational necessity, no documented exception, just a change and an empty explanation. Gillen returned. Ms. Bennett, we are going to open a formal review. Clara nodded. Good. I also want to apologize for how this was handled. She looked at him. Thank you. Then she added, but the apology cannot be the solution. Kevin listened. The solution is understanding why the first assumption was that I should move. Nobody spoke, because that was the question underneath everything. The seat was only the visible part. The decision was the real issue. Daniel looked toward Mrs. Whitmore. The woman seemed smaller now, but not defeated. She looked confused, maybe embarrassed, maybe defensive, human, and Clara noticed that too. She did not want a villain. She wanted accountability. There was a difference. Kevin received another update. This time he looked surprised. The gate agent has been located. And? Daniel asked. Kevin looked toward Clara. They said they moved the seat because they believed there was a customer preference issue. Clara frowned. A customer preference issue? Yet, Tom. Kevin nodded. They said another passenger requested a more suitable seat. Clara looked at Mrs. Whitmore. The woman immediately shook her head. I never said anything about her. But Kevin's device showed something else. A note had been attached to the change. Only 4 words. VIP comfort concern reported. No name, no explanation, no verification. Just 4 words that had been enough to move one passenger out of her seat, and suddenly the question was no longer who sat in 3A. The question was who had been considered important enough to believe without being checked. Part 6. The second problem in motion. The words on the screen remained simple. VIP comfort concern reported. 4 words, no name. Explanation. No record of who raised the concern. But Clara Bennett knew something about systems. The most dangerous failures were rarely caused by one person making one obvious mistake. They happened when a small decision moved through a chain of people, and everyone assumed someone else had checked. She looked at Kevin. Who entered that note? We're finding out. Who approved it? Kevin hesitated. Nobody. Clara looked around the first-class cabin. That's the problem. Kevin nodded slowly, because he understood now. The issue was no longer a passenger refusing to move. The issue was that a passenger had been moved without the airline being able to explain why. Mrs. Whitmore folded her hands on the table. I still think this has gotten out of proportion. Yet Clara turned toward her. Maybe. The woman seemed surprised by the answer, Clara continued, but that doesn't mean it started that way. Mrs. Whitmore looked away. For the first time, she did not have an immediate response. Kevin stepped into the aisle and spoke with operations again. This time, he asked different questions. Not what happened, but who had the authority to make it happen. Clara listened carefully. She had learned that organizations often revealed their priorities through the questions they asked. If they asked how to make the problem disappear, they were protecting themselves. If they asked how the problem was created, they were looking for the truth. A few moments later, Kevin returned. The gate supervisor is joining the review. Here? Daniel asked. A terminal. Kevin looked at Clara. He said he wants to explain. Clara nodded. Good. Mrs. Whitmore gave a small laugh. Explain what? That someone made a mistake? Clara looked at her. That depends on whether the mistake was random. The woman's expression changed slightly. What does that mean? Clara did not answer immediately, because she did not know yet. And she refused to pretend she did. That was another thing people misunderstood about accountability. It was not about arriving with a conclusion. It was about refusing to stop before the facts were complete. The young woman who had witnessed the beginning of the situation finally introduced herself. Rachel, she said. Clara looked over. Rachel? Rachel Moore. Thank you for speaking up. Rachel nodded. I almost didn't. Why? Rachel looked toward the aisle. Because I thought maybe I was making things worse. Clara understood that answer. Many people did. They saw unfairness. They noticed something wrong, but they calculated the cost of being involved. That's usually how these things continue, Clara said. Rachel looked at her. Because people stay quiet? Because people convince themselves their voice won't matter. Rachel looked down. Down, what happened? Clara turned toward her. You did? Rachel pulled out her phone. I take notes when I travel. Weird habit. It was not a video, not a dramatic recording. Just notes, a timeline. A simple account of what she saw. Clara appreciated that, because real evidence was often ordinary. A timestamp, a memory. A person willing to say, I was there. Kevin asked Rachel if she would be willing to provide a statement. She hesitated, then nodded. I will. That decision mattered. Not because it solved everything, because it changed who was carrying the weight. A few minutes later, Kevin received another message. He read it carefully. Then his face changed. Is something wrong? Daniel asked. Kevin looked toward Clara. The gate supervisor found the original request. From whom? Kevin looked down at the screen. The request was not made by Mrs. Whitmore. Everyone paused. Clara frowned. Then who made it? Kevin did not answer immediately, because the answer created a new problem. The request came from a customer service escalation channel. You're awaited. Meaning? Kevin looked at the empty seat. Someone contacted Meridian Atlantic before boarding. About what? Kevin swallowed. The message said a passenger in first class was making another customer uncomfortable. Clara felt the meaning before he finished the sentence. Not because she knew the sender, because she knew the pattern. Someone had not reported a behavior. They had reported a feeling, and someone else had converted that feeling into action. Kevin continued. The note did not mention your name. Clara looked at him. But it described me. Nobody responded because that was the part nobody wanted to say. The system had not identified a problem. It had responded to a perception, and now Meridian Atlantic had to decide whether it was willing to examine how that perception became powerful enough to remove a paying passenger from her own seat. Kevin looked at Clara. We need to delay departure. For the first time that morning, the decision came from the airline. Not because Clara demanded it. Not because she revealed who she was, because the airline finally understood the problem could not leave the gate with them. Part 7. The Collision and Accountability Test. The decision to hold the aircraft came from the cockpit, not from Clara. Not from a phone call. Not from a person trying to prove they had influence. Captain Elias Turner made the announcement after speaking with operations. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief operational delay while our team completes a required passenger service review. We appreciate your patience. The announcement was careful, professional, almost too careful. Clara sat in 3A now, her seat. The same seat that had started everything. But she did not feel victorious. The delay had created another kind of pressure. People were looking. Some passengers were curious. Others were irritated. A few had already decided what story they believed. That was the part she understood most. Facts moved slowly. Assumptions traveled quickly. Kevin returned with the gate supervisor, joining through a video call on a tablet. The man introduced himself as Marcus Hale. He looked tired. Not surprised. Tired. It's Bennett, Marcus said. I want to apologize for the disruption. Clara looked at him. Before we discuss an apology, I want to understand what happened. Marcus nodded. That's fair. It was the first response that sounded different, not defensive, not rushed. Fair. Kevin placed the tablet where everyone involved could see. We have confirmed 3 things, he said. First, Ms. Bennett's original seat assignment was valid. Second, the seat was changed manually after boarding was finalized. Third, the change was connected to a customer concern submitted before departure. Clara nodded. What was the concern? Marcus looked uncomfortable. The message stated that another passenger in first class was causing discomfort. Describe behavior? Marcus hesitated. No. Did it describe a safety issue? No. Did it identify a policy violation? No. Clara waited. So it described a feeling. Marcus did not answer. He did not need to. The silence was enough. Mrs. Whitmore looked toward the window. I didn't make that complaint. Ure looked at her. I believe you. The woman turned. You? Yes. That surprised everyone, including Mrs. Whitmore. Clara continued. Because this is bigger than whether you personally requested my seat. The distinction mattered. For the first time that morning, Mrs. Whitmore was not being treated as the entire problem. She was part of the chain, not the whole chain. Rachel, the witness, watched carefully. She had expected anger. Instead, she saw something harder. Control. Marcus looked through the records. Here is another issue. Kevin turned. What? The customer concern was escalated under priority handling. Why? Marcus looked down. The account profile. Clara waited. Whose account? Marcus did not answer immediately. Is Whitmore's. The woman frowned. My account? Yes. The system marked the request as a priority customer interaction. Mrs. Whitmore looked genuinely confused. I didn't ask for priority. Marcus nodded. I understand. But the information created another layer. The system had not only accepted a vague concern, it had amplified it, because the person attached to the concern had a status flag. Clara leaned back. So the system didn't ask whether the concern was valid. Marcus looked at her. It processed it faster because of the account category, and nobody verified the impact on the other passenger. He looked down. No. The word sat there. Simple. Uncomfortable. Ill. Daniel spoke quietly. I should have handled this differently. Everyone looked at him. He continued. When I first arrived, I focused on getting the seat issue resolved quickly. I didn't ask enough questions. Clara appreciated the honesty. But honesty was not the same as repair. What would have happened, she asked. If I had accepted the temporary seat? Nobody answered. Because everyone knew. The flight would have left. The record would have shown a normal adjustment. The person moved would have been the person who complied. And the system would have learned nothing. Marcus rubbed his forehead. There is something else you should know. Kevin looked over. What? Marcus hesitated. The customer service channel that received the complaint is being reviewed for similar escalations. Clara looked at him. How many? We don't know yet. That answer changed the atmosphere. Not because it revealed a hidden conspiracy, because it revealed uncertainty. And uncertainty meant work. Real work. It's interviews, record reviews. Not a single apology at the gate. Marcus looked directly at Clara. We need your permission to include your incident in the internal review. Clara considered the request. This was the moment where she could make the situation about herself. Demand compensation. Demand punishment. And public action. Instead, she asked a different question. Will the review examine why the system trusted one person's discomfort over another person's confirmed assignment? Marcus paused. Yes. Then include it. Rachel looked at Clara. You're not asking them to punish someone? Clara looked toward the cabin. I'm asking them to understand what allowed this to happen. Kevin received another message. He read it, then slowly turned the screen toward Marcus. A new report had arrived. Not about Clara. About the customer service channel. The review had found multiple previous cases where vague comfort concerns resulted in black passengers being questioned, relocated, or subjected to additional screening. Not a single incident. A pattern. And now Meridian Atlantic had a decision to make. Treat this as an uncomfortable morning, or admit the morning had exposed something that had been happening quietly for much longer. Part 8. The decision and its cost. The report did not arrive as a dramatic accusation. There was no employee confession. No single person stepping forward to admit they had made a choice based on appearance instead of facts. It arrived as something far more difficult for an organization to ignore. A pattern. Marcus Hale sat quietly while the internal review team explained what they had found through the preliminary audit. The customer escalation channel had been designed for situations where passengers reported legitimate concerns, safety issues, medical needs, service failures, or urgent travel problems. But over time, the language used in some requests had become less specific. Comfortable. Doesn't seem right. Concerned about the passenger. Need assistance. Those phrases had appeared repeatedly. By themselves, none of them proved discrimination. That was the uncomfortable truth. The system had not recorded someone writing an openly biased statement. It had recorded something more complicated, a series of vague judgments that were allowed to become actions. Clara listened carefully. She did not want a simpler story than the facts provided. She had seen enough investigations fail because people searched for one villain instead of understanding the structure that allowed the problem. Marcus looked at her. We're placing an immediate hold on that escalation process until the review is complete. Clara nodded. What happens to passengers currently affected by similar cases? Marcus looked at the audit team. That's what we're determining. That cannot wait for months. Marcus understood. Because this was the difference between acknowledging a problem and responding to one. The airline could investigate its past, but passengers were still traveling tomorrow. Kevin stood near the galley, listening. Earlier that morning, he had thought his job was to keep boarding moving. Now he understood his job had been different. His job was to notice when keeping things moving meant pushing one person aside. Captain Turner entered the cabin after receiving an update from operations. I understand the review is complete enough for us to proceed, he said. Urge surprised Clara. Proceed? The captain nodded. The aircraft is safe. The issue has been addressed. The passenger matter has been documented. Clara looked at him. That answer was technically correct, but she knew technical correctness could still miss the human part. Captain, I appreciate that. She paused. But I want to ask something. Of course, if I had moved when they asked me to, would this review have happened? The captain did not answer quickly, because he understood the question. not whether the flight could continue, whether the system would have learned anything. No, he admitted. Clara nodded. That's the part that concerns me. The captain looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. You're right, it was a simple admission. It mattered, because accountability required someone to acknowledge not just what happened, but what almost happened. Marcus approached Mrs. Whitmore. Ms. Whitmore, I want to speak with you as well. The woman looked nervous. I didn't do anything wrong. Marcus nodded. Yeah. I understand that you were not responsible for creating the system note. She relaxed slightly. But we do need to review how your account was used in the process. The distinction was important. Clara noticed it. The airline was beginning to separate facts from assumptions. Mrs. Whitmore looked at Clara. I really didn't ask them to move you. Clara believed her. I know. The woman seemed surprised again. Then why did you keep pushing? Clara looked at the seat between them. Because even if you didn't request it, someone made a decision based on a concern that was never verified. Mrs. Whitmore was quiet. Then she said something Clara did not expect. I suppose I never thought about who gets believed first. Clara looked at her. Neither woman smiled. Neither pretended the moment fixed everything. But it was honest, and honesty was where repair had to begin. Before the aircraft door closed, Marcus returned with the immediate decisions. The gate supervisor would be removed from direct customer escalation duties pending review. The customer service priority channel would be suspended. A broader audit would examine similar cases, and Meridian Atlantic would contact affected passengers if the review identified improper handling. Clara listened. The consequences were not dramatic, no instant collapse, no public spectacle, no entire department disappearing in a single phone call. Just processes changing because people had finally looked closely enough. That was how real systems changed, slowly, sometimes later than they should. But visibly. As Clara finally settled into seat 3A, she looked at the small screen attached to the armrest. Flight details appeared, destination, time remaining, seat number, a normal travel screen. But the morning had changed the meaning of that seat, not because it belonged to her, because it had revealed how easily belonging could be questioned. Kevin stopped beside her before returning to his duties. I want to apologize again. Girl looked up. This morning was difficult. He nodded. Yes, but I hope you remember this moment. Bill. She looked toward the cabin. Remember that the first person asking a question is not always the problem. Kevin nodded, and this time he wrote something down. Not as a report, as a reminder. The aircraft finally pushed away from the gate. But the review had already begun, and for Meridian Atlantic, the hardest part was not admitting that something went wrong. It was discovering how many times something similar had happened without anyone stopping to ask why. Part 9. Repair under pressure. 3 weeks after Flight 482 landed, Clara Bennett returned to Meridian Atlantic's headquarters. The building looked different from the outside only because she was seeing it differently. The same glass walls, the same polished lobby floor. The same employees moving between meetings with coffee cups and laptops. But Clara had learned something important during the flight. Organizations did not reveal themselves when everything was working. They revealed themselves when something uncomfortable forced them to decide what mattered. She entered the review room carrying no legal team, no public relations advisors, no stack of demands, just a notebook. Inside the room were people from operations, customer service, compliance, and passenger relations. Marcus Hale was there. Ishan Ross was there. So was Daniel, the flight attendant who had first asked her to leave her seat. Rachel Moore, the passenger witness, joined remotely. The review had taken longer than expected. That was not a surprise. Investigations rarely moved at the speed of public anger. They required interviews, system analysis, comparisons, people checking whether memories matched records. The final report was placed on the table. Marcus opened it. We reviewed 184 priority customer escalation cases from the previous 12 months. Clara listened. 23 involved requests that were categorized as comfort or concern issues without a documented safety, service, or policy basis. He paused. 7 of those cases involved passengers being relocated, questioned, or delayed. Clara looked at the document. Were those passengers contacted? Marcus nodded. Yes, what happened? His expression changed. Not all of them responded. Clara expected that. Because many people who experience unfair treatment do not always want to return to the place where it happened. They do not want another conversation, another explanation, another opportunity to be told they misunderstood. What did you change? Clara asked. Marcus turned a page. Several things. The first was operational. The priority escalation channel had been redesigned. A. Concerns could no longer trigger a passenger-impacting action without a documented reason and supervisor verification. The second was training. Not the kind where employees memorized a few sentences and returned to the same habits. Scenario-based training. Real situations, real decisions, real consequences. The third change involved accountability. Employees who created or approved undocumented passenger actions would be subject to review, not automatic punishment. Review. Because the goal was not fear. The goal was responsibility. Clara appreciated that distinction. A system built only on punishment encouraged people to hide mistakes. A system built on accountability encouraged people to correct them. Kevin spoke next. I want to say something. Everyone looked at him. He shifted in his chair. When this happened, I thought my job was to prevent a delay. He looked down. I didn't realize I was treating the person raising the concern as the delay. The room stayed quiet. Not because the words were dramatic, because they were honest. Clara nodded. That realization matters. Kevin looked at her. But it only matters if what you do afterward changes. He nodded. I understand. Across the screen, Rachel spoke. I want to add something. Everyone turned toward her. I almost didn't give my statement. She smiled slightly. I kept thinking, I only saw part of it. Clara listened. But that was enough, Rachel continued. Hey, I wasn't the person who made the decision. I wasn't the person who changed the seat. I just saw the beginning. Marcus nodded. And your statement helped establish the timeline. Rachel looked surprised. I didn't think it would. That's why witnesses matter, Marcus said. Not because they solve everything alone. Because they prevent people from pretending nothing happened. Clara looked around the room. That sentence stayed with her. Because the hardest part of many situations was not proving every detail. It was preventing reality from disappearing. After the meeting ended, Clara walked through the hallway alone. She stopped near a large window overlooking the airport. Planes moved across the runway below. Thousands of people traveling, thousands of decisions being made. She thought about how close the situation had come to ending differently. If she had moved, if Rachel had stayed silent, if Kevin had accepted the first explanation, if nobody had asked one more question, the outcome would have looked completely normal. And that was what bothered her most. The most difficult problems were often the ones that left no visible damage. Later that afternoon, Meridian Atlantic released a public statement. It did not mention Clara by name. It did not celebrate an executive partnership. It did not present the airline as a hero for fixing a problem it had created. It acknowledged a review. It described changes. It committed to measuring whether those changes worked. For Clara, that mattered more. Because an apology could close a conversation. A measurement system showed whether anything had actually changed. Before leaving, Marcus handed her a copy of the final report. On the cover was a simple title, Passenger Trust Review. Findings and corrective actions. Clara placed it in her bag. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. The seat on Flight 482 had never been valuable because it was first class. It mattered because for a few minutes a system had decided one person's comfort was more important than another person's right to be there. And the only reason that decision was challenged was because someone refused to let a quiet mistake become an accepted one. Part 10. The Last Consequence and Open Horizon. 6 months after Flight 482, Clara Bennett returned to the same airport. She arrived earlier than necessary, not because she was worried about missing her flight, because she wanted to see something. Not the first-class cabin, not the gate, the process. She walked through the terminal carrying the same leather bag she had carried that morning. The handle still had the small scratch near the bottom corner, the one she had noticed while standing beside seat 3A, waiting for someone to decide whether her own boarding pass was enough. Back then, the scratch had been the only thing she could focus on while people decided what to do with her. Today, it was just a scratch. A small reminder of a larger moment. Meridian Atlantic had completed the passenger trust review. The company had changed the escalation system. Supervisors were required to document the specific basis for passenger-impacting decisions. Customer concerns could no longer be converted into operational actions without verification. Employees had completed new scenario training, and the airline published quarterly reports measuring those changes. The results were not perfect. Clara did not expect them to be. A system that had existed for years did not change because people held one meeting and promised to do better. Change required repetition, measurement, people willing to notice when old habits returned. That was the part organizations underestimated. Repair was not one decision. It was thousands of smaller decisions made after nobody was watching. At the gate, Clara saw Kevin Ross. He was reviewing boarding information on a tablet. When he noticed her, he smiled, Miss Kevin. They shook hands. There was no awkwardness. No need to pretend the morning had not happened. How are things? Clara asked. Kevin looked at the tablet. Busy. She smiled. It sounds accurate. He laughed quietly. Then his expression became more serious. I wanted to thank you. Clara shook her head. For what? For not letting us turn it into a simple customer complaint. She understood what he meant. Because that would have been easier. A customer upset about a seat. An employee who made a mistake. An apology, a refund, a closed file. Instead, the question became harder. Why did the system respond the way it did? Kevin continued. We've had employees come forward since the review. About what? Situations where they felt pressure to prioritize certain passengers without asking enough questions. Clara nodded. That's important. Kevin looked surprised. You're not surprised? No. Why? Because systems teach people what gets rewarded. He considered that. If people see that speed matters more than accuracy, they learn speed. And if they see status matters more than fairness, they learn that too. Clara looked through the terminal windows. An airplane moved slowly toward the runway. Different passengers, different destinations, different stories. That was the strange thing about large systems. The people inside them often believed they were making isolated choices. They did not always see the pattern they were creating together. Her phone vibrated. Message from Maya. Maya, the Community Health Coalition wants to speak with you about the rural clinic project. They said the Meridian Review changed how they think about patient access issues. Clara read the message twice. The healthcare partnership with Meridian had continued. But that was not the most important outcome. The conversation had expanded beyond her company. Hospitals, organizations, and community groups had begun discussing a different question. Not only who had access to technology, but who was trusted when they entered the room asking for help. Still, Clara put the phone away. She did not see herself as someone who had fixed everything. She knew better. One flight could reveal a problem. One review could correct a process. Fairness was not something an organization achieved once. It was something people had to practice. As she boarded her flight, Clara paused at her seat, 3A. The number looked ordinary. It always had. The difference was what she knew now. A seat could be reassigned, a record could be changed, a process could fail. But people still had a choice about what they did when they noticed. She placed her bag beneath the seat and looked out the window. The runway stretched ahead. Beyond it were thousands of miles of road, thousands of decisions, thousands of moments where someone would have to decide whether to accept the first assumption or ask one more question. And somewhere inside Meridian Atlantic's new review system, a new report was waiting. Not about Clara, about a different passenger, a different route, a different concern. The review team had not contacted her because the first case was unfinished. It had contacted her because it was complete, and now they wanted to know what she thought about the next one. Clara looked at the message. For a moment she did not answer. Then she saved the file. Not because she knew what came next, because she understood that the hardest part of change was never proving that one person deserved a seat. It was building a world where nobody had to prove it twice.